The Fall and Flight. Washington's long retreat in 1776. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the world begins to slow and the mind drifts toward calm, there are stories that linger, not for their noise, but for their weight, for their power to echo through time, whispering to us not in triumph, but in resilience. Tonight, I invite you to travel back with me, not just into the past, but into the soul of a young, trembling nation. It was the summer of 1776. The ink on the Declaration of Independence was barely dry. In Philadelphia, bold words had been written, of freedom, of self-governance, of a people breaking the chains of empire. But in New York, the price of those words was about to be counted in blood. In bitter retreat, and in the quiet collapse of hope, George Washington, barely into his role as commander-in-chief, stood at the helm of a ragtag army. Brave, yes, but mostly untested, often disobedient, and poorly equipped. The British? They came in full force, ships that covered the harbor like a forest of masts. Red-coated soldiers marching in formation, Hessian mercenaries polished and relentless. The greatest army in the world had come to squash a rebellion, and the rebels were vastly outnumbered. What followed was not a battle, but a reckoning. Brooklyn, Kips Bay, White Plains, Fort Washington, one by one, losses mounted. Washington's army was pushed from hill to swamp, from fort to ferry, from confidence to collapse, and yet, he endured. This is not just a story of strategy. It's not merely about lines drawn on maps or regiments moving through the night. It's a story about men, about what happens to courage when the cold sets in, when shoes rot off your feet, when comrades disappear without a word. It is about leadership in its loneliest hour. And amid the horror, there were also moments of grace, of providence, of boats that arrived just in time, of fog that rolled in thick and silent, hiding retreating men from British fire, of leaders who stayed behind so others could escape, of ordinary people, shoeless, hungry, frightened, who kept walking. As you listen tonight, let the pace slow, let your mind wander gently to the sounds of distant cannon fire, the creaking of old ships, the shuffle of weary boots on frozen roads. This is not the story of victory. It is the story of survival. And sometimes, that's the greater story. So dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, let your eyes rest, and follow me now, through the hills and rivers of New York and New Jersey, across the bridges and through the towns, as we walk in the footsteps of a retreating army, and a nation not yet born, but too stubborn to die. Dear friends, if the stories we share here on Dreams of Time mean something to you, if they bring history to life in a way that stirs your heart or settles your mind, we ask just one small favor. If you're still here with us now, please type the number 1 in the comments. That little gesture tells us we're not alone in this journey. It helps the channel grow, and gives us strength to continue crafting these tales of the past, not dry, not dusty, but full of breath and memory. And now, let us begin the deeper story of the New York campaign and the long, cold shadow it cast across America's first fight for freedom. Close your eyes and imagine the wind on your face, colder than usual for late summer. The year is 1776. The hopes of a new nation flicker like a candle, dancing in the dark shadow of a mighty empire. In this moment, as the sounds of drums echo off distant hills and sails rustle in the harbor breeze, we step quietly into a world on the brink. Tonight, we are not just telling a story. We are walking in the footsteps of men who stood in the rain with threadbare coats and empty stomachs, who believed, often desperately, that liberty was worth more than comfort, or even life. This is not the story of heroic charge or sudden victory. This is the story of withdrawal, of choices made not in glory, but in shadows. It is a tale of midnight retreats, painful mistakes, unexpected mercy, and a commander who would not surrender. Not even to despair. George Washington is not yet the marble monument we know today. Here, in the streets of Brooklyn, across the rivers of New York, and on the muddy roads of New Jersey, he is a man under siege, by enemy armies, by doubt, by the weight of leadership. We often think of revolution as a storm of fire. But sometimes it is more like frost creeping under the door, freezing the breath in your lungs as you wait for news that might never come. And yet, in those quiet, bitter hours, something survives. So tonight, let us slow down, let the noise of the world drift away. Turn down the lights, take a deep breath, and join me, not as a soldier, not as a general, but simply as a witness. Because what happened in the fall of 1776, in New York and beyond, did not win the war, but it made victory possible. It taught the fledgling American army that survival, humble, muddy, aching survival, was a kind of triumph too. Washington's campaign in New York was full of missteps, miscommunications, and misfortune. But it was also full of quiet courage, of men standing their ground against impossible odds, and of a leader learning, painfully, what it truly meant to command an army, and to lead a revolution. And dear listener, as you settle in with your blanket or pillow, perhaps this story will comfort you the way it has comforted generations of those who, in dark times, sought something deeper in the past, something like hope. Scroll so now, if you're still with me. If this quiet walk through history brings you some peace, some curiosity, some wonder, then please leave the number 1 in the comments below. It helps this small channel carry on, and brings this storytelling to others who, like you, believe that history can be soft, slow, and powerful. Now, let's begin our journey into the mist. Into the retreat, into the quiet courage of 1776. The summer of 1776 in New York was radiant, unnervingly so. The skies glowed crystal blue. The East River shimmered with sunlight. But beneath this beauty, tension rippled like wind through tall grass. The Declaration of Independence had just been signed, bold ink on bold parchment. But the reality of that declaration was about to be tested. For General George Washington and his unseasoned army, the war for independence had officially begun. New York City was the next chessboard, strategically placed, economically crucial, and vulnerable on all sides. The British knew they must take it. And the Americans knew they must try, somehow, to hold it. But no one, not Washington, not his officers, not his men, were truly prepared for what would come. By late August, the British arrived in force, more than 400 ships, their masts like a dead forest growing out of the harbor, sails stretching like ghosts across the water. It was the largest amphibious assault in British history until the 20th century. 32,000 troops, 15,000 sailors, thousands of Hessian mercenaries. The earth itself must have trembled under the weight of such arrival. Washington watched from Brooklyn Heights, gazing across the water. His army, poorly trained, half-supplied, and barely clothed, could not match the firepower or numbers. But still, they stood. Still, they waited. He had hoped to defend Brooklyn with strength and confidence. But already, cracks were beginning to show. A misreading of terrain, a failure to guard Jamaica Pass, a lack of cavalry to report enemy movements. On the morning of August 27, the sky still blue. The British struck. They moved like water, silent, coordinated, flowing around American positions, a frontal assault to distract, and a massive flanking maneuver through the unguarded Jamaica Pass. General Sullivan and General Sterling, commanding parts of the American defense, were overwhelmed from multiple sides. Smoke, cannon fire, Musket cracks echoed through the forest and farmland. General William Howe, calm and deliberate, outmaneuvered the Americans without resorting to a full, bloody assault. His choice not to push further that day, still debated by historians, spared Washington's army from complete destruction for the moment. At one point, the Americans fought back valiantly, General Sterling leading a desperate last stand against the elite British Highlanders, sacrificing himself to buy time for others to escape. But by afternoon, the outcome was clear. The Battle of Brooklyn was a disaster. Thousands of Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. The British had won the largest battle of the war. And yet, the war was not over. That night, as darkness fell and clouds rolled in, Washington gathered his council. He had a decision to make: fight to the end, or retreat in silence. He chose retreat, a retreat not of cowardice, but of necessity, of wisdom. And here, dear listener, is where one of the most extraordinary moments in American military history took place: a silent escape across the East River under cover of fog. With the help of Massachusetts fishermen turned soldiers, Washington's army moved silently across the water. Thousands of men ferried back and forth all night, in small boats muffled with cloth, rowing under the noses of the British Army and Navy. Not a single shot was fired. Not a single life was lost in the crossing. By morning, the fog thickened mysteriously, just long enough to hide the final boats. When British scouts finally advanced, they found nothing but empty trenches and abandoned fires. It was, as one British officer later remarked, a piece of generalship that America may boast of to the end of time. But it was not just skill. It was grace, providence, perhaps even fate. As the American army regrouped in Manhattan, the mood was somber. They had survived, but they had not won. And the British were not finished. They would pursue, again and again, in a campaign of slow unraveling. The campaign for New York was only just beginning. And for Washington, the hardest days were still ahead. It is easy to think of war in terms of winners and losers. But in Brooklyn, in the summer of 1776, there was only survival. And sometimes, survival is its own kind of victory. We will continue, dear listener, with the days that followed: the relentless British advance, the failure at Kip's Bay, the heartbreak of Fort Washington, and the quiet resilience of men who still believed that liberty, even in retreat, was worth fighting for. But before we move on, if you're still here, if you're feeling something stir in your heart as you listen, I gently invite you again to leave a number 1 in the comments below. It tells me you're here. It tells me this story matters to you, the way it matters to me. Now, we move forward into the storm. After the silent escape from Brooklyn, Washington's army stood bruised but breathing. Across the East River, the British army held the heights, confident, advancing slowly. Manhattan lay ahead. The city shimmered, but like a candle about to be snuffed. It was September 1776, and the campaign was shifting into a brutal new phase. Washington hoped Manhattan could be defended, but the ground was uncertain. The men were exhausted, sick, demoralized. They had no cavalry, no navy, few cannons, and dwindling supplies. In contrast, the British were methodical. They advanced in full ranks, their red coats glowing in the sunlight, their banners unfurled like prophecy. Then came the disaster at Kip's Bay. On September 15, the British launched a massive amphibious landing. Flatboats carrying 4,000 British troops crossed the East River and made landfall at Kip's Bay. On Manhattan's East Shore, American militia stationed there panicked. They fled without firing a shot, dropping their weapons, leaving behind their posts, their dignity, their courage. Washington arrived in time to witness the chaos. He was stunned, enraged, For the first and only time in the war, he lost his composure. He reportedly rode into the retreating men, whipping his horse, shouting, drawing his sword, "Are these the men with whom I am to defend America?" he cried. But the moment passed. He could not stem the tide. The British quickly seized most of Manhattan. Washington withdrew north, narrowly avoiding entrapment. Morale fell further. Rumors of desertion and mutiny spread. Thousands of soldiers vanished in the night, slipping away into the woods or the city's shadows. Some defected to the British. Others simply went home. But still, not all was lost. Just days after Kip's Bay, Washington ordered a counterattack at Harlem Heights. And here, for a moment, the tide turned. American troops, fighting from wooded high ground, held firm and then advanced. They pushed back the British light infantry, inflicting real casualties, proving they still had fight left in them. It was a minor victory, but it lifted hearts. Washington needed it. The men needed it. A small sign that this cause could still endure. But this glimpse of hope was short-lived. Soon, British General Howe turned his attention north. He sought to trap Washington's army between the Harlem River and the Hudson. His forces landed at Throg's Neck, but the peninsula's marshy terrain thwarted them. Delays cost days. American riflemen blocked causeways. The British re-embarked. Then came the landing at Pelham Bay. Colonel John Glover and his Massachusetts men, fishermen turned soldiers, fought tenaciously behind stone walls, holding back superior numbers for hours. Once again, the Americans delayed the British long enough for Washington to escape north. Still, each day, the army retreated, from Brooklyn, from Manhattan, from Harlem Heights, and now, toward White Plains. Washington's army moved like a ghost across the land, beaten, but not broken. They trudged through mud and stone, cold nights and warm fears, always a step ahead of the British advance. At White Plains, they dug in. The line stretched across high ground, flanked by a hill called Chatterton's Hill, a key defensive position. But the British came, 13,000 strong, and they came with fury. On October 28, the British and Hessians attacked. A fierce battle raged on Chatterton's Hill. American militia broke under pressure, but reinforcements, Marylanders and Delaware troops, held their ground fiercely. Cannon fire thundered, smoke choked the air, men fell, limbs torn, bodies broken. The Hessians eventually overran the position, but at a high cost, over 250 British casualties. Still, the Americans withdrew again, and now, a decision had to be made. All of Manhattan had been evacuated, except one position, Fort Washington. Perched on a bluff on the northern tip of the island, Fort Washington stood as the last American stronghold in New York City. Its commander, Colonel Robert Magaw, believed it could be held. General Nathaniel Greene agreed. They thought the fort's steep hills and earthworks would protect it. Washington was unsure. In a letter to Greene, he wrote, "I am inclined to think it is best to evacuate, but I leave the decision to you." Being on the spot, and so, with reluctance, the fort remained. It was a tragic mistake. The British knew Fort Washington's layout. A traitor, William Dement, had defected and handed over the plans. They knew the weakness of the defenses. They prepared a four-pronged assault, Hessians from the north, British under Cornwallis from the east, more Hessians from the south, and another diversion from the Harlem River. At dawn on November 16, the attack began. The Hessians stormed the rocky northern slopes, shouting, "Huzzah!" as they climbed steep cliffs under fire. One Hessian wrote, "We dragged ourselves up by roots and rocks, men falling on every side." From the south, 150 Americans with a single cannon held off hundreds of British under General Percy. But resistance, however brave, could not stop the wave. By early afternoon, the defenders were pushed inside the fort. There was no room, no escape, just desperation. Colonel Magaw was given an ultimatum: surrender or be annihilated. He asked for half an hour. Howe gave none. At 3 p.m., Magaw surrendered. At 4 p.m., over 2,800 American soldiers marched out and laid down their arms. It was the most devastating loss of the war so far. Washington, watching from across the Hudson, was silent. Some say he wept. Others say he simply turned away. One witness wrote, "He seemed to have aged a year in that moment." The fall of Fort Washington meant not only the loss of troops, but the loss of cannon, supplies, morale, and most of all, hope. And yet, in the darkest hour, a glimmer of humanity emerged. Among the defenders was a woman, Margaret "Molly" Corbin, the wife of a Pennsylvania artilleryman. When her husband fell, she took his place, firing cannon until she too was wounded. She became the first woman in American history to receive a military pension. A spark of courage, glowing in the shadow of disaster. That night, the British crossed the Hudson. Fort Lee fell without a fight. Washington's army fled south, into the heart of New Jersey. Ragged, worn, on the run again. Thus ends the chapter of Manhattan. Not with victory, but with survival. Not with glory, but with endurance. Washington had lost New York, but not the war. He would retreat across the rivers, across the fields and forests, holding on to the thread of a cause that refused to die. And as we shall see in our next chapter, from that retreat would rise a quiet, stubborn kind of hope. Stay with us, dear listener, and if you're still here, if this story still walks beside you in the quiet of your evening, please consider leaving a comment, a like, or simply the word "still here." It means more than you know. Let's continue. In our next chapter, The Long Retreat. The wind was colder now. The golden light of autumn had faded into gray November skies. The leaves fell away like illusions, revealing a harsh, unforgiving land and an army on the run. The defeat at Fort Washington was not just a loss. It was a wound, deep, wide, and still bleeding. Washington's army had lost nearly 3,000 men in a single day. They had abandoned Fort Lee days later, retreating so quickly that they left behind tents, food, even breakfast still cooking on campfires when the British arrived. The chase had begun. It was November 21st. 1776, and General William Howe had sent 4,000 troops under Cornwallis across the Hudson River in the pouring rain. Scaling the steep cliffs of the Palisades by night, they moved with stealth and speed. The American army had no time to fight. Their only choice was flight. Washington's ragged column pushed south through the marshes and towns of New Jersey. Rain turned the narrow roads to mud. Wagons sank. Cannon wheels broke. Many soldiers had no shoes. They wrapped their feet in rags or straw. Some left bloody footprints on the frozen ground. They marched in silence. Behind them, the redcoats followed, methodically, almost patiently. It was as if the British army believed the war might simply dissolve from exhaustion. But Washington did not dissolve. Not yet. He rode at the rear of the column, solemn and watchful. One young officer, a 20-year-old Virginian named James Monroe, remembered the sight vividly, his countenance composed, firm, yet touched by sorrow. I had never seen such dignity in defeat. Each day brought the army farther south, from Newark to New Brunswick, from Trenton to the Delaware River. Towns fell behind them like dominoes. And as they moved, men slipped away. Desertion became epidemic. Hunger, fear, and despair gnawed at the ranks. Soldiers left by the dozens. Some crossed to the British. Others simply vanished. Joseph Reed, Washington's trusted aide called it a slow disintegration. He considered quitting himself. Washington stayed quiet, but inside, the weight pressed down. In a letter to Congress, he wrote, "Our cause will be lost unless speedy and effectual measures are adopted." He pleaded for more men, longer enlistments, better pay, more discipline, but Congress was paralyzed by fear of a standing army. They wanted citizen soldiers, militia, short-term fighters, and short-term they were. Many men's enlistments expired on December 1st. Thousands would be free to leave, and many did. By early December, Washington had fewer than 3,500 men under his personal command. He sent urgent messages to generals across the region. "Come now," he wrote to Charles Lee in New York. "Join us before it is too late." But Lee delayed, slow to march. To the north, General Heath guarded the Hudson Highlands. In Philadelphia, Congress debated but took no decisive action. Pennsylvania militia stayed home. New Jersey volunteers came in trickles. Washington sent Reed and General Mifflin ahead to Philadelphia and Burlington, pleading with governors and local leaders. But they returned with grim news. The people were weary, divided, perhaps losing faith. In one letter, Joseph Reed wrote, "I fear it is not too late for ruin." Still, they marched. On November 28, the American army reached Trenton. On the Delaware River, the bridge was the last connection to Pennsylvania. Washington ordered it taken up behind them. On December 1st, they crossed into Pennsylvania. The river rolled behind them like a final barrier. The enemy was now just miles away. But Washington's retreat was complete. He had saved what remained of the army, barely. Gentle piano begins, soft and melancholic. At night, they camped in frozen fields. Firewood was scarce. Blankets were few. Many soldiers were ill. Some simply fell asleep in the snow and never woke up. But it was not just physical suffering that haunted them. It was the knowledge that they had lost everything. Brooklyn, Manhattan, Forts Washington and Lee. The retreat through New Jersey had left the countryside exposed, unprotected. Farms were looted, towns frightened. Loyalist sentiment grew. And worst of all, Congress had fled Philadelphia. The capital was nearly empty. Some officials even spoke of retreating to Baltimore. Washington began to speak privately of retreating into the Appalachian Mountains, perhaps to Augusta County, Virginia, if the army collapsed completely. He told Reed, "My neck does not feel as though it was made for a halter." He was not joking. The noose of failure was closing. Yet in this darkest moment, something strange happened. As the American army stopped to breathe, cold, broken, hunted, a strange kind of stillness came over the land. The British stopped advancing. General Howe, ever cautious, chose not to push forward. They believed the rebellion was nearly over. They were wrong, because in the shadow of this long retreat, a new resolve was forming. In Pennsylvania, a fiery pamphleteer named Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense, rode with the retreating army. He saw the ragged men, heard their stories, and felt the pain of their despair. He took up his pen again and wrote the words that would echo across history. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. The words were printed and read aloud by campfires. They stirred something in the soldiers, something small, but real, a spark, a second wind, and in Washington himself, that spark turned to fire. He began planning something daring, something that would turn the tide. But that is a story for the next chapter. Dear listener, if you're still here with us, through mud and frost, fear and fire, leave us a quiet sign, a comment, a number, the word, hope, because even in retreat, Even in ruin, the journey goes on. And as the snow begins to fall, something extraordinary is about to happen. The snow had begun to fall. Tiny white flecks, soft as whispers, settled on the shoulders of soldiers huddled by dying fires. It was Christmas night, 1776. The American Revolution was barely breathing. General George Washington sat silent in his tent, surrounded by maps, candles, and the weight of an entire cause. The army had dwindled to fewer than 3,000 men. Their enlistments would expire in days. Many had no coats, no shoes, no hope. Some sat by the river and wept. And yet, at this bleakest moment, when many expected the war to quietly end in failure, Washington made a decision. A bold one, a dangerous one. He would attack. Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. His plan was simple and almost insane. The target was Trenton, New Jersey, a sleepy town across the icy Delaware River. Garrisoned by about 1,500 Hessian soldiers, German mercenaries hired by the British. The Hessians were disciplined and dangerous, but on Christmas night, perhaps, they might be vulnerable. Perhaps they'd be celebrating. Perhaps they'd let their guard down. Washington hoped so. The American army, or what remained of it, would cross the frozen Delaware River under the cover of darkness. Then march 9 miles south and launch a surprise attack at dawn. But the weather had other plans. As night fell, a nor'easter swept in, the temperature plunged, ice formed thick on the river. The wind howled like wolves. Sleet turned to snow. Crossing the Delaware became a nightmare. The boats were led by Colonel John Glover's Marblehead mariners, tough, experienced sailors from Massachusetts, in heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats. They rowed silently through the storm. Horses and cannons were loaded onto ferries. Men slipped on wet boards, nearly falling into the icy water. One soldier remembered, "The storm was so violent we could hardly see or hear. Ice struck the boat like hammers. We feared we might not make it across at all." Yet by 4 a.m., the crossing was complete. They had done it, but they were already behind schedule. The sun would rise before they reached Trenton. Still, they marched. 9 miles, in snow up to their knees. Muskets grew wet. Frost formed on beards. Some men collapsed in the cold. 2 froze to death along the way. But the column kept moving, silent, steady, stubborn. As they approached Trenton, the sky turned pale with dawn. And then, at 8 a.m., December 26, Washington gave the order. Attack. The American forces descended on Trenton from 2 directions. They caught the Hessians entirely off guard. The Germans had celebrated the night before but had not posted strong patrols. Their commander, Colonel Johann Rall, was warned of enemy movement, but ignored it. It would be a fatal mistake. The American guns opened fire on the town. Cannons boomed down the main street. Hessian soldiers rushed from their barracks, some still buttoning coats, others clutching weapons without cartridges. Musket fire rattled off stone walls. Smoke filled the narrow alleys. Washington rode at the front, his coat flapping, his face frozen but focused. He called out orders calmly. As bullets zipped by, one officer later wrote, "The general moved like a statue of determination." He seemed not to notice the danger. Within 45 minutes, the battle was over. Colonel Rall, shot in the side, died later that day. The Hessians surrendered, over 900 taken prisoner. Dozens more killed or wounded. A stunning victory. And not a single American soldier died in battle. News of the victory raced across the colonies like wildfire. After months of retreat, disaster, and despair, this small, icy triumph changed everything. In Philadelphia, bells rang, churches filled with prayers of thanks. In Boston, fireworks lit up the sky. Even in Europe, Diplomats took notice. The American cause, thought dead, had risen from the snow. Gentle flute music fades in, hopeful, calm. But the victory at Trenton was more than military. It was psychological. Soldiers who had been ready to quit re-enlisted. Civilians who had doubted began to believe again. The idea of liberty, fragile and flickering, burned brighter. Thomas Paine, who had marched with the army through New Jersey, wrote again, "The harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtained too cheap, we esteemed too lightly." Even British officers admitted surprise. General Howe had not expected a winter attack. He had assumed Washington's army would dissolve before spring. Instead, the rebels had struck first. And Washington wasn't done. Just 1 week later, on January 2nd, the British launched a counterattack at Trenton. Washington, vastly outnumbered, held them off in a tense skirmish. Then, under cover of night, he slipped around the enemy and marched again. January 3rd, the Battle of Princeton. Another surprise. Another victory. British forces scattered. American morale soared. Within 10 days, the tide of the war had shifted. Washington had turned retreat into momentum, despair into daring. And most miraculously of all, the American Revolution had survived the winter. So what does this chapter teach us? That even in the coldest, darkest hours, when all seems lost, a single spark of courage can reignite the fire. That the path to freedom is not always grand or glorious. Sometimes, it's muddy, frozen, and desperate. And yet, heroes emerge, not from comfort, but from crisis. So, dear listener, if you're still with us, thank you. Thank you for walking through the snow and silence of history. If you believe this story matters, if you carry a spark of its meaning, leave us a comment with a snowflake or a simple, "I'm still here." Your presence keeps this journey alive. And now, let us continue forward, into the next chapter, where the revolution rises stronger than before. In the chill of late summer, when the leaves had not yet turned but the winds carried a new tension, a young country stood trembling on the edge of collapse. It was 1776, the year the Declaration of Independence was signed. A year often remembered with the glow of hope, of liberty, of a nation being born. But for those who wore worn-out boots, who slept in the wet fields of Long Island, who bled quietly into the soil of Brooklyn Heights, 1776 was not a year of triumph. It was a year of retreat, of fear, of near ruin. Tonight, dear listener, we return to those early days of the American Revolution, not to glorify war, nor to recount battles for their strategy alone, but to rediscover the emotional heartbeat of a people fighting for survival. We begin with George Washington, not as the marble giant we now revere, but as a man, exhausted, bewildered, and often unsure, a commander who had never before led such an army, facing an enemy that vastly outnumbered and outmatched him in nearly every way. He would lose more than he won, and yet, he endured. We walk beside the men of the Continental Army, young and old, farmers and blacksmiths, sons and fathers, most barely trained, poorly armed, often shoeless. We feel the cold rain soak through their clothes. We smell the burnt powder of failed defenses. We hear their silent prayers, whispered in the dark, not for glory, but for a chance to see morning. And we see New York, not the New York of glass towers and honking horns, but a smoky, muddy, embattled colony where fire, fog, and betrayal shadowed every step. But amid the heartbreak of loss, Brooklyn, Kips Bay, White Plains, Fort Washington, we also find unexpected courage, not only in generals but in women like Margaret Corbin, who took her husband's place at the cannon, and in common soldiers who marched though starving and sick, simply because their commander still rode at the rear, refusing to give in. This is not a story of glorious victory. This is the story of how America almost didn't make it. And so tonight, with your blanket pulled close and the world slowing around you, let us step into this forgotten chapter of tragedy and tenacity, of missteps and miracles, and walk gently and quietly through the harrowing autumn of 1776. Candle. Dear friends, if the stories this channel shares mean something to you, and if you're still here with us in these opening moments, please consider leaving a simple 1 in the comments below. Your quiet presence, your gentle encouragement, gives this channel the strength to keep bringing you stories of the past that comfort us in the present. Now, let us begin the full tale of the New York campaign and the desperate retreat that followed. It was a calm summer morning when the sky above Staten Island turned gray with sails. A forest of masts stretched across the horizon, hundreds of ships crowding the waters, their canvas wings taut with purpose. The British had arrived. They came in numbers that defied imagination. Nearly 32,000 troops. British regulars in crisp red coats and tall Hessian mercenaries with gleaming brass buttons poured into New York Harbor. The thunder of their arrival echoed down narrow colonial streets and across golden fields of grain. It was the largest amphibious invasion the continent had ever seen. And facing them was George Washington. He had only 19,000 men. Many were farmers who had never heard a cannon fire. They had no navy. Their muskets were mismatched. Their powder was damp. Their shoes, if they had any, were cracked and threadbare. But they had made a declaration, and they would now have to defend it. The British general, William Howe, did not rush into battle. Instead, he waited. Weeks passed as more ships arrived. He gave his men time to recover from their voyage and watched the Americans dig trenches and fortify Brooklyn Heights. Washington, meanwhile, split his forces, some in Manhattan, some on Long Island, trying to guess the British move. It was a decision he would come to regret. On August 22, 1776, Howe made his move. 15,000 British and Hessian troops landed at Gravesend Bay on the southwest shore of Long Island. Locals watched in silence as waves of redcoats disembarked, each regiment like a clockwork machine. The landing was methodical, controlled. No opposition met them. Washington, still uncertain whether the main attack would strike Manhattan, held his stronger forces back. The days that followed were tense. Like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks, American troops under Generals Sullivan and Putnam prepared for a frontal assault. They placed their men along three key passes through the wooded hills of Brooklyn: the Gowanus Road, the Flatbush Pass, and, critically, Jamaica Pass. But that last route was left almost unguarded. Washington didn't know it yet, but this oversight would prove disastrous. At night, British troops moved silently through the thick woods, guided by loyalist farmers who knew the land well. On August 26, under the cover of darkness and thick fog, a British force led by General Clinton and Lord Cornwallis marched 9 miles to the east, through Jamaica Pass, flanking the American line completely. The trap was now set. At dawn on August 27, 1776, the battle began. American pickets near Flatbush Pass were the first to fall. Hessian troops stormed forward with bayonets gleaming, drums pounding. The Americans resisted bravely, but they were overwhelmed by the ferocity of the assault. Meanwhile, as the noise of gunfire filled the air, British troops who had flanked through Jamaica Pass fell upon the rear of the American lines. Chaos erupted. General Sullivan, caught between two British forces, tried to rally his men but was quickly captured. General Sterling, who held the center, fought valiantly with Maryland troops, known later as the Maryland 400, who charged again and again to buy time for others to escape. Nearly all of them were killed or captured. By noon, the battle was all but lost. Washington, watching from Brooklyn Heights, was stunned. For hours he could see the smoke rising, hear the cannons thunder, and glimpse the scattering shapes of retreating men. He reportedly exclaimed in anguish, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose!" But amid the defeat, a miracle unfolded. Thanks to a rearguard action in the terrain, a portion of the American force escaped to Brooklyn Heights. The British, having won the field, did not pursue the final blow that day. Some said General Howe was reluctant to risk heavy casualties. Others believed he still hoped for a peaceful surrender. Whatever the reason, the American army, badly shaken, but not destroyed, lived to see another sunrise. Night fell over the battlefield, and the moans of the wounded echoed through the trees. The fields of Gowanus were littered with broken muskets, torn flags, and the fallen, and in the flickering candlelight of his command tent, George Washington faced the terrible truth: New York might soon be lost. He had been outmaneuvered, outplanned, outfought, but he had not yet been broken. Darkness draped over the battered American army like a shroud. It was the evening of August 28, 1776. Just a day earlier, thousands of Washington's men had been crushed in the fields and forests of Brooklyn. They were bruised, bloodied, and trapped, penned in between the East River behind them and a far stronger British army in front. The British fleet loomed nearby, prepared to sail upriver and cut off all hope of escape. Washington stood at the edge of disaster. His army had dug in atop Brooklyn Heights, a steep bluff with views of Manhattan across the water. But their position was now a cage. Had the British attacked the next day, or had the winds shifted to bring the British Navy into the East River, this story might have ended differently. The entire rebellion could have been choked off in a single stroke. But the wind did not blow, and the British did not move. Instead, they waited. Perhaps General Howe believed Washington would surrender. Perhaps he still clung to hopes of a political resolution. Whatever the reason, the British gave Washington a night, and that night would prove to be one of the most daring, miraculous escapes in military history. Washington called a council of war. His plan was desperate, even dangerous. Under the cover of darkness, he would evacuate the entire Continental Army, some 9,000 men, across the East River to Manhattan. No easy task. The river was wide, the night uncertain, and the slightest discovery by the British would spell annihilation. But he had no other choice. That evening, a steady wind began to rise from the northeast, away from the British fleet. And as if Providence itself had lent a hand, a thick fog descended upon the river, so dense that one could not see 20 feet ahead. At 8 p.m., under the command of Colonel Glover and his Marblehead fishermen, experienced sailors from Massachusetts, flat-bottomed boats began ferrying troops, horses, cannon, and supplies across the river. There was no moon, only the sound of oars in water, hushed voices, and the rustle of boots on packed earth. Trip after trip, hour after hour, they rowed. Time became a blur. Soldiers who had fought the day before now stood silently in lines, awaiting their turn. Wounded men were carried, limping and groaning. Muskets and wagons rattled softly in the dark. Glover's men never paused. Washington was everywhere, checking lines, calming nerves, encouraging silence. And when the final boats began loading, he refused to leave until every last soldier was aboard. By dawn, most of the army had crossed, but there were still troops left to evacuate, and the fog, their only shield, began to thin. Panic stirred. They had run out of time. And then, another miracle. Just as the sun was about to rise, the fog thickened again, denser than before. Glover's men rowed faster, sweat pouring as they pulled with everything they had. Finally, as morning light crept over the masts of the idle British fleet. The last American soldiers stepped onto Manhattan soil. The British never saw them go. When the Redcoats advanced into Brooklyn Heights that morning, they found empty trenches, cold campfires, and silence. Not a single man remained. It was, as one officer wrote, a perfect evacuation, a deliverance for the ages. In that moment, George Washington had saved the revolution. But survival did not mean safety. The escape from Brooklyn was not a victory, it was a retreat. The American army had slipped from the jaws of capture. But the British were not done. They would pursue, push, and punish Washington's men in the months to come. Still, the escape lit a spark. For days, newspapers across the colonies reported the miraculous retreat. Even among defeat, there was courage, there was leadership, there was hope. And though Washington himself did not boast, he never did, his daring that night became legend. A general who had stood in silence on the riverbank, watching the last of his army cross under a veil of fog, refusing to leave until the end, had become a symbol of resolve, of grace under pressure, of the quiet strength that would carry the revolution forward, even in its darkest hour. It was the morning of September 15, 1776. The East River glistened under a calm sky, almost serene, betraying nothing of the storm about to unfold. On the western edge of Manhattan, American troops watched in nervous silence as the British fleet stirred to life. Sail after sail unfurled, longboats and barges dipped into the water, hundreds of oars glinting in the morning sun. The British were coming. Their target, Kip's Bay, a small, muddy inlet on the east side of Manhattan, now the scene of one of the most humiliating American failures in the entire war. Washington's army, having just escaped Brooklyn, was strung thin. Many soldiers were exhausted, barefoot, poorly trained. Some had no bayonets, no cartridges, and no idea what they were truly fighting for. Morale was low. Desertion was rising. At Kip's Bay, 500 American militiamen had been stationed to guard the landing zone. They were outnumbered, untrained, and deeply unprepared. And when the British struck, they struck hard. 5 British warships opened fire at once. A thunderous barrage of shot and shell tore into the shore. Trees exploded. Earth shook. The ground splintered under the force of naval guns designed to batter stone fortresses, now unleashed upon open fields and wooden fences. The noise was deafening. Before the Redcoats even landed, the Americans broke ranks. Some dropped their muskets. Others threw down packs and ran. Officers shouted, begged, pleaded, but the militiamen had seen enough. They bolted, many not stopping until they reached Harlem. 2 miles north. Into this chaos rode George Washington. He had galloped ahead of his staff, desperate to rally his troops and stop the collapse. But when he saw the full extent of the panic, men dropping gear, officers abandoning positions, he exploded. It was one of the rare moments in the entire war where Washington lost his composure. He cursed. He shouted. He struck several soldiers with his riding crop, trying to force them back into formation. At one point, he even drew his sword and dared the British to fire upon him. But it was no use. His army had scattered, and for the first time, Washington faced not just defeat but disgrace. The commander-in-chief stood utterly alone, exposed in an open field, his troops running behind him, the enemy landing before him. Only when his aides rode up and physically pulled his horse around did Washington retreat. It was a moment that haunted him. Candle. From there, the British moved swiftly. Within hours, they took control of Lower Manhattan. The American army retreated north, regrouping at Harlem Heights. Washington, still shaken, tried to rebuild discipline and order among men who had never seen a real war before. And in the middle of this storm, There was tragedy. That same week, a massive fire swept through Manhattan. It began late at night. Possibly accidental, possibly sabotage. Flames devoured nearly a quarter of the city. Homes, churches, and stores collapsed into ash. Civilians fled. British officers shouted commands in vain. And the skies above New York glowed red for miles. It was a symbol. The city, long a jewel of the colonies, now burned under British rule. Candle. Despite this chaos, one thing became clear. The war was entering a new phase. The fight was no longer about set-piece battles and formal confrontations. It was about survival, endurance, the long game. Kips Bay taught Washington a painful lesson. These weren't battles he could win with militia alone. If the revolution was to survive, he needed a real army. One with training, with courage, with conviction. The Kips Bay route became a turning point, not because it was heroic, but because it forced Washington to change. He became more pragmatic, more guarded. He stopped hoping that the British would make mistakes. He stopped relying on the undisciplined passion of volunteers. From this moment on, he would begin shaping the Continental Army into something more professional, more resilient, and in doing so, he laid the groundwork for the slow, steady resistance that would carry the United States through the darkest winters to eventual independence. Candle. Yet in that September morning, beneath the smoke, cannon fire, and cries of shame, Washington had stood alone on the field. Sword drawn, anger boiling, courage on display, even when all else had failed. It would not be the last time. The morning after the disaster at Kips Bay was heavy with silence. Washington's army had fallen back in disgrace. The rout had bruised their pride and sapped their will. But there was little time to mourn. The British were advancing again, and just a few miles north, at a place called Harlem Heights, Washington saw an opportunity. Harlem, in 1776, was not the urban sprawl it is today. It was rolling hills, scattered farms, thick woods, perfect ground for defense. Here, on September 16, the American troops camped, licking their wounds. But the British, perhaps overconfident from their easy victory, made a mistake. That morning, a small American patrol under Colonel Thomas Knowlton encountered a group of British light infantry. A quick skirmish broke out. The Americans fell back, but not in disorder. They returned to the main line with news. The British were close. The Redcoats followed, mocking the retreating Americans with bugle calls. Imitating a fox hunt, they were jeering, treating their enemy like game to be chased down. They had no idea they were walking into an ambush. Washington, calm and calculating, devised a trap. He ordered a detachment to swing around behind the British line, while he kept their attention fixed on the front. And when the moment came, he gave the order. The hills exploded with musket fire. American troops surged from the trees. Knowlton's men and a group of riflemen under Major Andrew Leach charged the British right. Though both Knowlton and Leach were fatally wounded, the plan worked. The British fell back in confusion. The Americans advanced. Shouts of press on, echoed through the woods. Washington, watching from a nearby ridge, saw something he hadn't seen in weeks: confidence. For the first time since the start of the campaign, the American troops were not running. They were fighting and winning. Candle. The battle lasted nearly 2 hours. Washington, always cautious, refused to chase too far and risk a counterattack. But he allowed the army to feel the full weight of their victory. The British had been beaten, not badly, not decisively, but they had been pushed back. And for an army reeling from defeat, that meant everything. Even British General William Howe, usually dismissive of his enemy, took note. That night, as the sun set over Harlem, a sense of renewal settled over the American camp. The soldiers built new confidence brick by brick. For once, they had stood their ground, and in doing so, they proved to themselves, and their commander, that they were not beaten yet. Candle. But the war was far from over. Washington knew that this small victory could not blind him to the reality ahead. The British still controlled Manhattan. Their navy still dominated the rivers. And his army was still undertrained, undersupplied, and dangerously outnumbered. But in that moment, Harlem Heights gave him breathing room. It gave him hope. And perhaps more importantly, it reminded his soldiers of what they were fighting for. They were not just rebels fleeing a stronger force. They were patriots holding a line. They were part of something bigger than themselves. And in the echo of musket shots through the Harlem woods, that truth rang clearer than ever. Candle. Later that evening, Washington wrote to Congress. His tone was steady, composed. He described the engagement in modest terms, downplaying the victory. But his words betrayed a quiet pride. He knew how close the army had come to collapse. He knew how easily it might have ended at Kip's Bay. But it hadn't. Harlem Heights would not be remembered as a major battle, but in the heart of the revolution. It marked a turning point. A moment when despair gave way to determination. A moment when George Washington, weathered and weary, began to believe that this war might still be won, not in a single stroke, but in persistence, in patience, and in the slow, steady courage of ordinary men who refused to give up. In war, there are moments that stretch beyond tactics, moments where decisions are made not from maps or logic, but from instinct, pride, or hope. And in November of 1776, George Washington made such a decision. It was a gamble, one that would cost him dearly. The British had taken most of New York. Their navy owned the rivers. And their army had pushed the rebels off Manhattan Island. But one lonely stronghold still remained, Fort Washington. Perched on the northern tip of Manhattan, the fort sat on a rocky height overlooking the Hudson River. It was a pentagonal patch of earthworks, just 4 acres in size. No barracks, no fresh water, no deep entrenchments, but it stood tall, a symbol, perhaps, of stubbornness more than strategy. Washington debated abandoning it, but Nathanael Greene, his trusted general, urged him to hold the fort. It would, Greene argued, tie up British troops, protect the Hudson, and maintain a foothold in the city. Washington hesitated. He even wrote to Greene, saying, "I am inclined to think it will be best to evacuate." But he didn't order it. He left the decision to Greene, left it to the men on the ground. And so the fort stood, isolated and doomed. Candle. On the morning of November 16, under heavy fog and winter wind, the British came. 8,000 redcoats and Hessian mercenaries surrounded Fort Washington from 3 sides. General Wilhelm von Knyphausen led the main assault from the north, his 4,000 Hessians charging over steep, wooded ridges under withering fire. One officer recalled the terrain as almost inaccessible. Another said they had to drag themselves up by roots and rocks. But they made it. With bugles blaring, they burst onto the hilltop shouting, "Huzzah!" A wave of blue and brass rolling through the trees. To the east, General Cornwallis crossed the Harlem River with Highlanders in flatboats, pressing toward the eastern defenses. And from the south, General Percy's force of 3,000 British and Hessians pushed forward, capturing the Morris House within 15 minutes of Washington's exit. The Americans were overwhelmed, outnumbered nearly 4-1. Their outer lines collapsed. Some resisted with incredible courage. One battery of 150 men held off 800 British with a single cannon. But it couldn't last. By early afternoon, the defenders were driven back into the fort. There was no more room to retreat. Around 1 p.m., Hessian General Knyphausen sent a demand for surrender. Colonel Robert Magaw, commander of the fort, asked for a half-hour to decide. By 3 p.m., Washington, watching helplessly across the river, received the news. The fort had fallen, and with it, the last American stronghold in Manhattan was gone. Candle. Nearly 3,000 American soldiers marched out and laid down their arms. It was the worst defeat of the war so far, a staggering blow to morale, to manpower, and to Washington himself. Only weeks before, the army had suffered a string of retreats. But this was different. This was catastrophic. Washington had watched the disaster unfold from across the Hudson. Some said he wept. Perhaps not outwardly, he was too reserved, but certainly within, he had held on too long. He had gambled, and he had lost. Candle. The days that followed were grim. The prisoners were marched to British jails and floating prison ships, overcrowded, unheated, ridden with disease. Hundreds would die. The fort's loss cost the Continental Army more than just men. It cost them arms, supplies, 146 cannons, and nearly all of their hard-won momentum. Even Charles Lee, a vocal critic within the American command, lashed out. He wrote angrily to Congress, claiming he had warned Washington, "Draw off the garrison or they will be lost." In truth, the blame was shared. Washington had doubted. Greene had insisted. No one had stopped the storm. And yet, Washington, true to character, did not cast blame. He simply said he had acted on the judgment of others. But deep down, he must have known, as commander-in-chief, the responsibility was his. Candle. Still, in the wreckage, there were sparks of resilience. One such spark, Margaret "Molly" Corbin. When her husband was killed beside a cannon, she stepped forward to take his place, loading and firing the gun until she was struck by grapeshot. She survived, wounded and nearly losing an arm, and became the first woman in U.S. history to receive a military pension. A glimmer of bravery in a day so dark. Candle. As night fell, Washington ordered an evacuation from nearby Fort Lee, knowing it would be the British's next target. In the pouring rain, British troops under Cornwallis scaled the cliffs of New Jersey and stormed the empty fort. Only a handful of Americans remained, too drunk on stolen rum to flee. The army abandoned everything: supplies, tents, half-cooked breakfasts still on fires. The retreat had begun in earnest. It was a bitter end to a disastrous chapter. And yet, the war was not over. The fire of independence still burned, dim, flickering, but alive. And Washington, battered but not broken, would lead his tattered army south, across New Jersey, toward one last desperate chance. A glimmer, a river, and a surprise that no one, not even the British, saw coming. The sun was low on the horizon as the last men slipped away from Fort Lee, leaving their breakfasts to burn over open fires. It was November 21, 1776. The Continental Army was in full retreat, tattered, hungry, soaked from days of rain. They trudged through the back roads of New Jersey, with the British Army right behind them. They were broken. They were fewer than 3,000, many without shoes, their feet wrapped in rags. Their coats were threadbare. Some slept in muddy ditches, their bellies empty, their spirits crushed. George Washington rode at the rear of the column, silent, steady, the picture of calm. But inside, his thoughts raced. He had lost New York, lost Fort Washington, lost most of his army. His letters to Congress and close advisers revealed a man on the edge of despair. "I am wearied almost to death with the retrograde motion of things," he wrote to his brother. In secret, he even considered retreating all the way to the mountains of western Virginia, to the frontier, where the army could regroup, far from the enemy's reach. It was a last resort, But Washington had to think that way. Because if New Jersey fell, Pennsylvania would be next. And then, Philadelphia, the heart of the Revolution. Candle. In desperate need of help, Washington sent two of his most trusted allies, Joseph Reed and Thomas Mifflin, to rally support. They went to New Jersey and Pennsylvania, pleading with local militias and governors for reinforcements. But the results were bleak. Many in New Jersey had already given up. Others stayed home, hoping the storm would pass without them. They are slumbering under the shade of peace. Mifflin reported, disheartened. Candle. The retreat pushed south, first to Newark, then New Brunswick, then Princeton. Each day, Washington ordered the army to rise early and march before dawn, just hours ahead of the British advance. If they stopped for too long, they'd be surrounded. British troops crossed the Hudson in pursuit, hoping to finish what they started. One night, as they neared the Raritan River, the rain poured harder than ever. Men waded through mud, slipping under the weight of cannons and wagons. They left behind even more supplies, blankets, powder, tools. Many soldiers deserted, others simply collapsed. Candle. Among the few who stayed, Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense. He marched alongside General Nathaniel Greene's staff, wrapped in his writing cloak, scribbling by lantern light. And from that suffering came words that would ignite a revolution once more. These are the times that try men's souls. He wrote in The American Crisis. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But not Washington, not Greene, not the ragged few who remained. Candle. As December arrived, so did a cruel twist of fate. 2,000 soldiers' enlistments were set to expire on January 1st. If they left, as many planned, the army would dissolve. Washington now had less than 30 days to save the revolution. And yet, as all seemed lost, the British made a mistake. General Howe, believing the Americans finished, slowed his pursuit. The British set up winter quarters across New Jersey, their soldiers sleeping in warm homes, their commanders resting on victory. They didn't push to Philadelphia. They didn't crush the army while they had the chance. They thought it was over. But George Washington, cold, quiet, calculating, had one last move to make. Candle. On the far side of the Delaware River, in Pennsylvania, he let his men rest. For the first time in weeks, they ate warm food. They dried their clothes by fire. They dug in, and they planned. In silence, under frostbitten skies, they prepared for something bold. Not another retreat, not another defense, but an attack. Washington's target, the sleepy outpost of Trenton, New Jersey, held by 1,400 Hessian troops. The plan was daring. He would cross the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night, strike at dawn, and remind the world that America was not finished. It was dangerous, risky, and if it failed, the war might end. But Washington believed, and for the first time in months, so did his men. As we near the end of this chapter in history, we see the contours of a man pushed to the edge, of an army brought low, and of a nation on the brink. But also, we see something more, a flicker of resolve, a second wind, a storm waiting to break. It was the coldest night of the year, December 25, 1776, while much of the world gathered around warm fires to celebrate Christmas. George Washington's army prepared to cross the freezing Delaware River. This was no ordinary crossing. This was a desperate gamble. After months of defeat, after the catastrophic fall of New York, the loss of Fort Washington, and the humiliating retreat across New Jersey, Washington needed a miracle. He had fewer than 2,500 men. Many were barefoot. Some wrapped their hands in strips of cloth. One soldier was seen without pants. his legs bleeding through frozen rags. But they believed in the plan. They believed in their general. Candle. The target, Trenton, a small town on the far side of the Delaware, held by 1,400 Hessian troops, German mercenaries known for their discipline and brutality. The plan: a surprise attack at dawn. Washington split his force into 3 columns. 2 would fail to cross the river due to ice and strong currents. Only his own column, led by Washington himself, would make it. At 4 p.m. on Christmas Day, the crossing began. Ice floated like jagged blades across the current. Boats creaked. Men huddled together, soaked and shivering. Artillery pieces, heavy, iron beasts, were hauled across with oxen and ropes. Commanding the boats were the tough New England sailors of the Marblehead Regiment, led by Colonel John Glover. Their hands froze to the oars. Water seeped into boots. And yet, they rowed on. Candle. It took 9 hours to cross. By 4 a.m. on December 26, they were ready to march. The snow fell heavier now. Ice crunched beneath every step. One soldier wrote, "We marched until blood marked the snow." But they pressed forward. For 9 miles, they advanced in silence. Muskets wrapped in cloth to keep the powder dry. Orders given in whispers. Boots muffled in snow. They reached Trenton just before 8 a.m. Hessian commander Colonel Johann Rall had been warned of a potential attack, but he didn't believe it. He thought no one would be mad enough to attack in this weather. On Christmas, he was wrong. Candle. The American forces hit the town from 2 directions, Washington leading from the north, General Nathaniel Greene sweeping from the west. The Hessians scrambled from their beds, still half-dressed. Muskets not loaded. Cannon fire echoed through the narrow streets. Smoke and snow swirled. Private John Greenwood, just 16 years old, later recalled, "The scene was confusion itself. Men were running in every direction. Officers shouted orders. The roar of battle drowned everything. The Americans pressed in, block by block. Washington rode through the streets on horseback, visible to all, rallying his men. His bravery was undeniable. His presence electrified the ranks." Candle. Within 45 minutes, it was over. The Hessians surrendered. No Americans were killed in battle. 1 man was wounded, James Monroe, the future president. He nearly died, saved only by a local doctor who tied off his bleeding artery with a silver pin. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were captured. Cannons, muskets, powder, taken. It was the first major victory of the war. And it came when hope was nearly gone. Candle. Back in Philadelphia, news of the victory sparked joy and wonder. After months of retreat, it proved one thing above all. The revolution lived. Washington's army was not finished. His men, though ragged and hungry, still had fire in their hearts. And now, the British were shaken. They had thought the war nearly won. Now, they were reminded that Americans were capable of anything, even crossing an ice-choked river, on the coldest night of the year, to fight on Christmas morning. Candle. But Washington wasn't done. He had momentum, and he would strike again. On January 2nd, he tricked the British at the Battle of Assunpink Creek. Then, on the night of January 3rd, he slipped around their lines and attacked again, at Princeton. It was a smaller battle, but another victory. And it did something no one thought possible just weeks before. It forced the British to abandon most of New Jersey. They pulled back to New Brunswick. And Washington, tattered, tired, triumphant, set up winter quarters in the hills. Candle. The tide had turned. These victories did more than win land, they revived a cause. Recruitment soared, morale soared, and Washington's reputation, once on the verge of collapse, was now solidified. He was not a man of flashy victories or instant genius. He was something more dangerous to his enemies. He was determined, relentless, calm in the face of disaster. Candle. One British officer wrote, "We are facing a different kind of general than we imagined. He slips away just when we think we've won, and returns when we least expect it." Indeed, the revolution would not end in 1776. It had just begun. Candle. And so, dear listener, we arrive at a turning point. From the depths of defeat in New York, to the retreat across New Jersey, to the frozen banks of the Delaware, this was not just a campaign. It was a test of resolve. And it was passed. Against odds. Against despair. Against winter itself. After the victories at Trenton and Princeton, General George Washington had bought the Revolution time. Time to regroup. Time to rebuild. Time to hope. But winter was only beginning. By January 1777, the American army was a threadbare shadow of its former self. Most of the troops' enlistments had expired. Many had gone home. Supplies were vanishing. Disease spread through camps. And yet, Washington remained. He would not retreat. Instead, he chose to hold ground in Morristown, New Jersey, setting up winter quarters in the forested hills, a strategic location that allowed him to watch British movements in New Brunswick and New York while staying close to supply lines. The winter of 1777 would be cold, but the will of the army had begun to harden. Candle. Washington's leadership changed during this time. He was no longer the commander who simply reacted to events. Now, he anticipated, he planned, he evolved. He wrote to Congress often, urging them to fix the military's broken system, short enlistments, poor pay, disorganized supply chains. To John Hancock, he wrote, "If something effectual is not done, the cause will be lost." It is a melancholy reflection that in so short a time we have had such a change in the state of our affairs. And yet, through it all, he never publicly wavered. Candle. The men who remained with him were a unique breed. Ragged, often unpaid, marching without boots through the frozen snow. One private remembered, "We were near naked, few of us had blankets. Many had no shirts. It was our lot to be content with little, or perish. Food was scarce. Men survived on firecake, flour mixed with water. Baked on a rock, cold nights brought silence, save for coughing and whispers. Death visited often, but they stayed. Why? Because their commander stayed." Washington made it a point to be seen, walking among the tents, speaking to his soldiers, hearing their complaints. He didn't just lead, he endured. Candle. At the same time, the British remained in New York and parts of New Jersey. General Howe, despite being a talented officer, seemed content to wait out the winter. This proved to be a gift to the Revolution. For while the British rested in comfort, the Continental Army was becoming something new. A real army. A hardened army. An American army. Candle. And then, an unexpected gift arrived. From across the Atlantic came a group of European officers, drawn by the romance of revolution. Among them was a tall, young French aristocrat named Marquis de Lafayette. Just 19 years old, he had defied his king to sail to America. Washington took to the boy instantly. Lafayette, in turn, became deeply loyal to Washington, not just as a commander, but as a father figure. Also arriving was Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer with experience drilling troops in the style of Frederick the Great. Steuben didn't speak English, but he carried with him something more important, a system. He began training the troops, introducing them to bayonet drills, military discipline, and formations. He taught them how to be soldiers. He cursed at them in German and French, his translator trying to keep up, but the men respected him. For the first time, they were becoming professionals. Candle. Meanwhile, Washington knew another campaign was coming. He wrote, "This is not the work of a day. nor the triumph of a single battle. It is the labor of years, the trial of generations. He requested long-term enlistments, a standing army, better pay for officers, and a chain of supply. Congress, often hesitant and slow, began to listen. It was clear now, Washington was not just the best option. He was the only option. Candle. Outside the camps, war had turned political. In London, critics of the war grew louder. In France and Spain, diplomats debated whether to support the colonies. American ambassadors like Benjamin Franklin charmed the French court, slowly winning sympathy for the rebel cause. But nothing won support like survival. The longer the American army endured, the more Europe watched in admiration. How could these ill-equipped farmers keep standing against the greatest empire on earth? The answer, again and again, pointed to one man, Candle, General Washington. Candle. As the winter thawed and the snow turned to mud, the army began to move again. With spring came a renewed sense of purpose. The soldiers had learned, the leaders had evolved, and the world was watching. In Morristown, Washington wrote to Congress, "If we are to preserve our liberties, we must now prepare with greater zeal than ever before. The enemy will not yield unless we force them to." The revolution was no longer a desperate spark. It had become a flame. Candle and Washington, once doubted, criticized, almost replaced, had proven himself beyond question. Not by winning every battle, but by never quitting. By holding together an army that had every reason to collapse. By turning retreat into endurance, loss into learning, winter into resolve. Candle. And so, dear listener, as we close this chapter, let us reflect. In the silence of snow-covered woods, by firelight and frozen rivers, a nation was slowly forged, not just by muskets or speeches, but by the quiet, unbreakable will of those who refused to give in. If you're still here with Dreams of Time, please leave a comment or A1 to let us know you're still listening. It's the most precious gift for storytellers like us. And if you're ready for the next chapter, we're about to enter one of the most decisive years of the war. The year is 1777. The American Revolution has passed its darkest winter. George Washington's army, battered and bloodied, has learned to survive. But survival isn't enough. What the rebellion needs now is a spark. A moment to prove, to the world, and to themselves, that this cause is more than a dream. It came not from Washington, but from the wild woods of upstate New York, under a sky heavy with September clouds. It came from Saratoga. Candle. To understand this miracle, we must first return to the British strategy. In London, generals believed that by cutting the colonies in two, by seizing the Hudson River Valley, they could strangle the rebellion. The plan? A three-pronged advance. General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada with 8,000 British and Hessian troops. Colonel Barry Street Leger would strike east from Lake Ontario. General William Howe, from New York City, would move northward up the Hudson. All three would meet near Albany. The colony of New England, long the beating heart of revolution, would be cut off and crushed. On paper, it was elegant. In reality, it would unravel like thread in the rain. Candle. General Burgoyne, known as Gentleman Johnny, led his men through dense wilderness. But the American rebels, scrappy and determined, tore down bridges, felled trees across paths, and burned crops. Progress slowed, supplies ran thin, and then came Bennington, expecting loyalists and easy plunder. Burgoyne sent a detachment to gather resources. But instead, they were ambushed and routed by local militias under John Stark and Seth Warner. Burgoyne's losses were severe, especially among German Hessians. He began to realize, this land would not yield easily. Candle. Meanwhile, General Howe made a baffling decision. Instead of marching north to support Burgoyne as planned, Howe turned his army toward Philadelphia, seeking to capture the rebel capital. The British strategy shattered. Burgoyne was now alone, deep in enemy territory, surrounded, and slowly bleeding troops and morale. Still, he pressed on. Candle. The Americans, under the often unpredictable General Horatio Gates, had gathered a force of militias, Continentals, and backwoods fighters. Among them was a fiery officer named Benedict Arnold, brave, impulsive, and fiercely aggressive. At Saratoga, 2 battles would unfold in the golden woods of early autumn. First, the Battle of Freeman's Farm on September 19. Then, Bemis Heights on October 7. Arnold, though technically sidelined by Gates, threw himself into the fight, rallying troops, charging British lines, and leading from the front with reckless courage. At one point, his horse was shot from under him. Arnold was wounded, but the British lines were broken. Candle. By October 17, Burgoyne had no choice. His army, cut off and starving, surrounded by twice their number, surrendered. Nearly 6,000 British troops laid down their arms. It was the greatest American victory to date, and the world took notice. Candle. Word of Saratoga spread quickly, across the colonies and across the Atlantic. And in Paris, it changed everything. Candle. France had long watched the American rebellion with curiosity and quiet hope, but it had not yet dared to commit. Saratoga proved that the Americans could not only endure, but defeat the British. Benjamin Franklin, charming, brilliant, disarming, had worked tirelessly in the French court. Now, his moment had come. In February 1778, France formally recognized American independence and signed a treaty of alliance. The war had changed. The American Revolution was now a global conflict. Candle. For Washington, the news was electrifying. It meant French ships, French gold, French troops, and perhaps the real possibility of victory. But it also meant more pressure. With Britain now facing a world war, they would redouble efforts to crush the rebellion quickly. Every move from this point forward would matter more than ever. Candle. Still, Saratoga brought hope. One soldier wrote, "We had heard so little cheer for so long, and now the people danced in the streets. The church bells rang all night. It felt as though the land itself was breathing again." Candle. But behind the victory was tension. General Gates received full credit for the win. Benedict Arnold, whose reckless bravery had turned the tide, was ignored, slighted by Congress, insulted by his commander. The wound in his leg would heal, but the wound to his pride would not. That bitterness would one day return. Candle. And so, as winter crept toward the camps again, Washington prepared for the next phase. Victory at Saratoga, alliance with France, and a continental army that, while still weary, now dared to believe in a future beyond the fog. A future of liberty. A future they might actually live to see. Candle. Dear listener, if you're still here with Dreams of Time, and this chapter stirs something in your heart, please leave a comment. Or a simple number 1. So we know you're with us. Every word we whisper is a small candle in the dark. And thanks to you, it keeps glowing. There are winters, and then there are winters that change the world. This is the story of such a winter. It was December, 1777. The sky, a permanent gray. The trees, bare, skeletal, watching silently. The war had raged for nearly 3 years. Washington's army, though bloodied, had survived Philadelphia's loss, but with British troops quartered comfortably in the city. The American army now trudged westward, toward a stretch of barren hills near the Schuylkill River. The place was called Valley Forge. Candle. It wasn't the coldest winter on record. But for the men who arrived there, shoeless, Hungry and broken, it might as well have been the Arctic. Their feet left bloody prints in the snow. Many had no coats, no tents. Their rations were spoiled or missing. Diseases like smallpox, dysentery, and typhus spread quickly. More than 2,000 men would die that winter, not from war, but from suffering. And yet, this is not a story of collapse. This is a story of resolve. Candle. Washington chose Valley Forge not for comfort, but for strategy. It lay within striking distance of British-occupied Philadelphia. It could be defended, and it was close enough to the state assemblies in Pennsylvania to keep pressure on Congress. But his soldiers didn't see strategy, they saw misery. One young officer wrote, "We are an army of skeletons. Our hearts beat, but barely." Candle. And still, Washington remained. He rode through the encampment daily, speaking with soldiers, listening to complaints, encouraging faith. This wasn't just leadership, it was presence. The men saw him suffering beside them, sharing their hardship. And for many, that was enough to keep hope burning like a single ember in ash. Candle. But presence alone wouldn't save the army. What came next was perhaps the most important gift the Continental Army ever received. His name was Baron Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Candle. He was a former Prussian officer, stern, proud, and wearing a brilliant blue coat. When he arrived in Valley Forge in February 1778, the army was a mob, not a machine. Soldiers had no standard drills. Officers gave conflicting orders. Regiments fought with different weapons and dialects. Von Steuben watched, then acted. He selected 100 men as a training corps. Each morning, in the bitter cold, he drilled them, not just how to march, but how to move as one. Not just how to hold a bayonet, but how to charge in unity. He shouted in German, in French, in broken English. Sometimes he cursed so creatively his translator refused to repeat it. But it worked. Within weeks, that small corps could pivot, reload, and fire in rhythm. They became instructors, spreading von Steuben's discipline across the army like a fire spreading in a forest of dry pine. The Continentals were becoming soldiers. Candle. Meanwhile, supplies slowly trickled in. Washington's pleas to Congress finally began bearing fruit. Women, too, played their part, sewing, gathering food, nursing the sick. Martha Washington herself came to Valley Forge, bringing warmth and dignity to the camp. Day by day, the army held on. Candle. But Valley Forge was more than drills and desperation. It was a forge of identity. Men from different colonies, Massachusetts, Virginia, New Jersey, the Carolinas, learned to live, fight, and suffer together. They became not just Americans, but an American army. Candle. By the time the snow began to melt in April, the transformation was complete. Gone was the ragged mob. In its place stood a leaner, sharper, more unified force. A force ready to meet the British, not with luck, but with discipline. Candle. That spring, news arrived from Paris. France had entered the war, officially. Ships would sail, troops would come, and from the long winter of Valley Forge, the American cause emerged, scarred, but stronger. Candle. One soldier, looking back years later, wrote, "Valley Forge broke our bodies, but not our will. We left the hills that spring not as ghosts, but as something new. We had passed through the fire, and found ourselves." Candle. So remember, dear listener, great moments in history are not only forged in battles, but in silence. Not only in glory, but in grit. Not only in triumph, but in endurance. Valley Forge was the pause between storms. But what emerged would change the course of the war, and the course of a nation. Candle. Dear viewer, if you felt the quiet strength of Valley Forge in your heart tonight, Please consider leaving a simple 1 in the comments, or share your thoughts, so that others may join you by this digital fireside. Your support helps Dreams of Time continue telling these stories. In peace, at your pace. The year is 1778, and the world has changed. The American army is no longer the shattered remnant that limped into Valley Forge. Now, under Washington's command, and forged by fire, hunger, and Baron von Steuben's drills, it was a force reborn. And the British? They were on the move. Candle, Philadelphia, once the beating heart of colonial resistance, had been occupied by British troops for months. But after France entered the war, General Howe was recalled to London. In his place came General Sir Henry Clinton, tasked with a new directive: hold less, move more. Philadelphia was to be abandoned. The British Army would march back to New York. Nearly 10,000 redcoats and Hessians, accompanied by wagons, baggage, and loyalist families, began the long retreat across New Jersey. It was June, hot, humid, and dangerous. And Washington? He saw an opportunity. Candle. For the first time, the American army was ready to face the British on open ground. This was not the time for hiding, retreating, or hit-and-run tactics. It was time to strike a blow that would show the world, especially their new French allies, that the Continental Army could stand toe-to-toe with Britain's finest. And so, Washington gave the order: pursue them. Candle. The army moved swiftly. Among Washington's generals was the controversial General Charles Lee, recently released from British captivity and reappointed to command. Lee doubted the wisdom of attacking. He argued the risk was too high, that Washington's men still weren't ready for full-scale battle. But Washington overruled him. Lee would command the advance corps, about 5,000 men, and engage the British rearguard. If successful, the main army would follow and strike a decisive blow. The stage was set. Candle. June 28, 1778. The fields near Monmouth Courthouse, New Jersey, shimmered with heat. The temperature soared past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Horses collapsed. Men fainted from heatstroke before the first musket fired. Early in the morning, Lee moved forward with his troops. At first, all went well. Skirmishes pushed back the British rearguard. But suddenly, confusion spread through the American lines. Orders were unclear. Lee changed plans mid-march. The British, under General Cornwallis, counterattacked with speed and precision. Lee's lines wavered. Then they broke. The Americans began a retreat. Candle. What followed is one of the most dramatic moments in the entire war. Washington, riding with the main army, heard the sound of retreat. He spurred his horse forward, galloping through clouds of dust and frightened soldiers. He reached the field and found chaos, Lee's forces falling back, disorder spreading like fire. And in the middle of it all, General Washington, calm, fierce, and commanding. He exploded at Lee. Words history only partly records, but the moment was clear. The general-in-chief had arrived. Candle. With supreme composure, Washington rode among the men, rallying them, reforming lines. He turned retreat into resistance. Cannons were positioned, infantry braced, and when Cornwallis launched his next assault, he met stone instead of air. The two armies clashed in the sweltering heat for hours. Gunfire, bayonets, cannon blasts, smoke thick as fog. It was a brutal, grinding fight. Neither side gave quarter. At one point, a woman named Mary Ludwig Hayes, better known as Molly Pitcher, took her wounded husband's place at a cannon, swabbing and loading under fire. Candle. By nightfall, the field was littered with the fallen. Washington held the field, his troops bloodied but unbroken. The British withdrew under cover of darkness. While technically a draw, Monmouth was a victory of spirit. It proved to the world that the American army, trained, disciplined, and led, could meet the Redcoats in battle and not break. Candle. The next morning, Washington stood among his men. They had marched, fought, and held. Many would die from heat, not wounds, but the moment was earned. Candle. One officer wrote, "Never did I behold such resolution, such order, and discipline. Our general was sublime." Even British observers admitted, this was not the same army they had chased from New York. Candle. Dear viewer, the Battle of Monmouth didn't end the war, but it changed the narrative. From this point forward, the British understood, America's rebellion had matured. This was no longer a scattered uprising. It was a nation learning how to stand. Candle. And Washington? His leadership that day solidified his place, not just as a commander, but as a symbol of the revolution. He didn't win by maneuver, but by presence, courage, and will. Candle. As we let the echoes of musket fire fade, let's reflect on the quiet strength it took to survive that heat. To stand firm in the dust and chaos. Because history, as always, is shaped not just by the bold, but by the brave enough to hold their ground. Candle. Dear listener, if this story stirred something in you, I invite you, gently, to leave a 2 in the comments. Or share your thoughts with our little community here at Dreams of Time. These moments live because we remember them together. The war had changed direction, literally. With the Northern Campaign largely at a stalemate after Monmouth, British High Command turned its gaze toward the South. They believed the South held a larger number of loyalists, those who still clung to the crown. If the British could capture key southern ports and rally loyalist support, they could cut the colonies in half and squeeze the rebellion into submission. It was a gamble, and they were about to go all in. Candle. In late 1778, British forces seized Savannah, Georgia, almost without resistance. It was a quick, brutal blow, and it set the tone for what was to come. By spring of 1780, they had turned to a much bigger prize, Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was one of the most important cities in the colonies, a major port, a center of commerce, and the South's beating heart. General Henry Clinton led the British siege, bringing with him over 10,000 troops. Inside the city, General Benjamin Lincoln and about 5,000 American soldiers held on, hoping for relief that never came. After 6 weeks, surrounded and outgunned, Lincoln surrendered the entire city, the largest American capitulation of the war. Candle. The fall of Charleston was a disaster. It shattered morale in the South and handed the British control over the Carolinas. The British then unleashed their next commander into the countryside, General Charles Cornwallis. Cornwallis, sharp and ruthless, was determined to end the rebellion once and for all in the Southern theater. He had loyalist militias at his side, but what he didn't count on was the swamp. Candle. The Southern campaign was unlike anything the British had faced before. It wasn't rows of soldiers meeting on open fields, it was shadows in the trees, ambushes in the dark, and patriot fighters melting into the marshes. Enter Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. With small bands of guerrilla fighters, Marion struck quickly, disappeared faster, and left the British chasing ghosts. There was also Thomas Sumter, the Gamecock, and Andrew Pickens, the Wizard Owl. Their nicknames were more than folklore, they represented a new way of fighting. Ragged militias, often barefoot and half-fed, launching harassing strikes and then vanishing into the thickets. Candle. Still, the British held the advantage in firepower, training, and numbers. To counter them, Washington turned to one of his most trusted officers, General Nathanael Greene. Greene, The same man blamed by some for Fort Washington years before was now being given the hardest job in the war: take back the South. He accepted the mission, and what followed was nothing short of brilliant. Candle. Greene didn't try to win in one big battle. He couldn't. Instead, he embraced the strategy of exhaustion. He split his army, forcing the British to chase shadows. One wing, under General Daniel Morgan, won a stunning victory at the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781, where American forces used clever tactics to trick the British into overextending, then crushed them with a counterattack. Cornwallis, furious, began hunting Greene's army across the Carolinas. What followed became known as the Race to the Dan. Greene led Cornwallis on a punishing chase, stretching British supply lines and wearing down his army. Candle. Finally, the two armies met at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. It was March 1781. Greene arranged his men in 3 lines, the first of militia to absorb the blow, the next of more seasoned troops, and finally, a corps of Continentals. The British charged. They paid dearly. Though the British technically held the field, Cornwallis had lost a quarter of his men, a cost he could not afford. Candle. After the battle, Cornwallis made a bold move. He abandoned the interior South and marched his army north, toward Virginia. He believed that if he could cut the colonies from the center, capture key supply points, he could still win. But he was walking into a trap. Candle. Greene, meanwhile, reclaimed much of the Carolinas without having to win major battles. His strategy was simple but devastating. We fight, get beat, rise, and fight again. The British may have captured cities, but they never controlled the countryside. And without the people, no empire can rule. Candle. Dear listener, the Southern campaign was a slow burn, a battle not just of armies, but of will. It tested everything: patience, creativity, endurance. And through it all, America's ragged armies learned how to win without winning. Candle. Francis Marion, hiding in the cypress groves. Daniel Morgan, unleashing the trap at Cowpens. Nathaniel Greene, leading from behind but always forward. They all kept the flame alive. Candle. By the time Cornwallis reached Virginia, his army was bleeding from 1,000 cuts. He believed he could take shelter at a small coastal town, rest, resupply, and rejoin with the British Navy. That town? Yorktown. And that is where our final chapter begins. Candle. Dear friends, if this tale of resilience in the shadows has touched you tonight, you can gently type a 3 in the comments below. It tells me you're still with me, still dreaming with me, still wandering through time. Now, let us walk the final path to the end of empire. The year is 1781, and the American Revolution is approaching its most dramatic and decisive moment. General Charles Cornwallis, after months of fighting across the South, has moved his battered army into the small port town of Yorktown, Virginia. He thinks he is safe there. He thinks he will be rescued. He is wrong. Candle. Yorktown lies on a narrow peninsula, surrounded on 3 sides by water. Cornwallis begins to fortify the town, digging trenches, building redoubts, earthwork forts, and waiting for the Royal Navy to return. Meanwhile, Washington sees an opportunity, perhaps his only chance to end the war. But it won't be easy. Candle. At that very moment, General Washington is far away, outside New York City. He has been watching the British forces there for over a year, hoping to attack, but unable to act. But now, with French troops under General Rochambeau at his side, and the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sailing up the Atlantic, Washington makes a bold decision. He will march his army 500 miles south, from New York to Virginia, in absolute secrecy. Candle. What follows is one of the most masterful deceptions in military history. Washington leaves decoy camps and fake correspondence in New Jersey. British spies believe he still plans to attack New York. But by the time they realize the truth, it's too late. Washington is already halfway to Virginia, with 7,000 Continental troops, 4,000 French soldiers, and artillery for siege warfare. Candle. On September 14, 1781, Washington arrives in Williamsburg, Virginia. For the first time in the war, he sees the French fleet anchored offshore, completely cutting off Cornwallis by sea. For the British, there is no escape. Candle. The siege of Yorktown begins on September 28. Washington orders 2 lines of trenches to be dug around the city, slowly tightening the noose. The French on the left, the Americans on the right. Cannons roll into position. A deep silence falls. And then, candle. Boom, boom, boom. The bombardment begins, day and night. The ground shakes with the thunder of artillery. British defenses are smashed. Buildings burn. Ammunition stores explode. Inside the town, Cornwallis writes to General Clinton in New York, "My situation becomes every hour more critical. We cannot hold out much longer." Candle. To break the stalemate, Washington plans a bold night attack. There are 2 key British redoubts, number 9 and number 10, that must be taken to complete the second siege line. He assigns the French to attack redoubt number 9, and to redoubt number 10, he sends American light infantry, led by Alexander Hamilton. Yes, that Hamilton. Candle. On the night of October 14th, under cover of darkness, they move out. No talking. Bayonets only. No shots fired. They charge up the earthen walls, fighting hand to hand in the dark. Within 10 minutes, both redoubts are taken. Hamilton's men raise the American flag. French flags rise beside them. The line is complete. Candle. Cornwallis tries one last desperate gambit, a night breakout by boat. But a sudden storm shatters his plan. There will be no escape. By October 17, he sends a drummer out with a white flag. He requests a ceasefire to negotiate surrender. Candle. The surrender ceremony takes place 2 days later. October 19, 1781. British troops march between rows of American and French soldiers, defeated. Silent. Legend says the British band played the tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." Cornwallis does not attend. He sends his second-in-command instead, too ashamed to face Washington. Candle. And just like that, it is over. More than 7,000 British troops lay down their arms. It is the last major battle of the Revolutionary War. Candle. The news reaches London weeks later. Prime Minister Lord North, upon hearing it, reportedly gasped, "Oh God, it is all over." And indeed, it was. Candle. Peace would not come immediately. It would take 2 more years of negotiation, of uncertainty, of uneasy truces. But the die was cast. In 1783, the Treaty of Paris is signed. The British officially recognize the United States of America. The war is done. Candle. And so, dear friend, as we leave Yorktown behind, under the golden light of a Virginia sunset, what remains? What did it all mean? Perhaps it was this: that liberty is fragile, but powerful. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things. That when the world turns upside down, sometimes, it lands exactly where it should. Candle. If you are still with us, gently type the number 4 in the comments. It tells us you're awake, or drifting off, with dreams of freedom echoing in your mind. And now, we come to the final words of this story. Dear friends, you've just traveled more than 98 minutes through a sweeping, emotional, and sometimes heartbreaking journey One that began with the first sparks of revolution in New York and ended with the triumphant twilight at Yorktown. From the desperate foggy escape across the East River, to the bitter humiliation of Fort Washington, from the icy desperation of retreat through New Jersey, to the quiet resolve of Washington's march south, and the thunder of victory at Yorktown, each chapter wasn't just about battles or strategy. It was about human endurance. It was about doubt and leadership, sacrifice and fear, and the undeniable will to build something greater than oneself. Candle. We often forget, behind every textbook line or dusty name, stood a man trembling with cold, or a woman like Molly Corbin, standing alone beside a cannon, injured but unbroken. We forget the nights Washington couldn't sleep, not because he was tired, but because his army had no shoes, no food, and no hope. And yet, he did not give up. They did not give up. And that's what makes this story worthy of remembering. Candle. Here on Dreams of Time, we don't just tell stories. We tell them in a way meant to slow the world down, to calm the mind, to let you breathe. If this journey brought you a moment of peace, or helped you drift into sleep as your mind floated down a quiet river of history, then, dear friend, we've done our job. Sparkles. Now, a gentle request. According to the YouTube algorithm, the stories most likely to reach new hearts and curious minds are the ones with a lot of support from viewers like you. So, if you've made it this far, and this story meant something to you, please consider doing 1, 2, or all of the following. Checkmark, leave a like to show you were here. Checkmark, write a comment, even just a word or emoji. Or type the number 5 to let us know you're part of the Midnight Crew. Checkmark, and if you haven't already, subscribe to Dreams of Time, where more gentle journeys through history await you. Scroll. Every like, every comment, every new subscriber helps us bring these calm, slow-spoken stories to others who may need rest, reflection, or simply the comforting rustle of time passing. Candle. Until we meet again, dear listener, may your night be quiet, your dreams be kind, and your spirit ever curious. This was Dreams of Time. Good night, and thank you.